Hello and welcome to Network Africa. Coming up in a moment, analysts view Burundi as a ticking time bomb. The EAC and EALA try to salvage the situation after the African Union fails the East African country. Then the United Nations Security Council pushes for more unity and action to counter the expanding threat of the Islamic State. And later on, the United Nations Development Program raises a total of $60 million to fight the worsening drought in southern Africa. We're thrilled to have you join us on Network Africa live on Channels Television with me, Cynthia Are. Just before we bring you the latest from Burundi in our Focus on Burundi segment, let's bring you the latest regarding the presidential elections in Chad. President Idriss Deby, who's been in power for over 25 years now, is running for president again for a fifth term. The new AU chairman is encouraging the electorate to keep him as president, promising to reintroduce term limits if he emerges victor. Here's an excerpt of the statement he made. He says the principles of presidential term limits in the Constitution must be reintroduced. And today, nothing requires us to remain in a system where changing leaders becomes difficult. In 2005, the constitutional reform was conducted in a context where the life of the nation was in danger, unquote. President Deby's comments come amid controversial moves by the leaders of some African countries, including Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo Republic, who've challenged constitutional term limits to maintain power. Now, the crisis continues to spiral out of control in Burundi, specifically in the capital, Bujumbura. We understand that as at last night, there were sporadic shootings in what appeared to be an ambush east of the capital. Meanwhile, Israel's Ministry of Defense has removed Burundi from its list of 98 nations where Israeli exporters do not need permission to market non-classified weaponry and defense services. That is based on the suspicion of gross violation of human rights. In a separate development, in Burundi, all classes of Burundians seem to be fleeing to neighboring countries in an attempt to avoid being killed by the worsening crisis. The move by AU to refrain from deploying troops to Burundi continues to receive widespread criticism, even from the opposition in the country. For more on what's happening in Burundi, we go live to Bujumbura, where Mr. Jean-Regis Nduwimana is standing by. He's a media consultant and a university lecturer. Mr. Nduwimana, thank you so much for joining us. What's the latest in Bujumbura?
The last 24 hours was so calm, but we had last night a crash between an armed insurgent and some policemen, and one Musag inhabitant is reportedly injured by the live ammunition shot by the policemen during that crash. But otherwise, everything's still so calm. And Bujumbura, if you go in Bujumbura downtown, you may think that there is some tension because there's some policemen and the heavy armed militaries in the city center of Bujumbura.
Now, what's happening regarding the investigations into the human rights violations, including the mass graves? Are the investigations actually being carried out?
Not really, but the commission in charge of reconciliation in Burundi yesterday discovered a mass grave, but they assumed that the bodies they found in that mass grave was kind of killed in 1993 during the civil war, and that's the only report we have up to now, but nothing else about any investigations, serious investigations about the recent reported mass graves after the military base attacked in December.
So right now you can't see anything on ground that suggests that these investigations are going on, but you only heard about what happened yesterday.
Not at all. Not at all.
Well, Mr. Ndwimana, thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, on that note, we're going to bring you some of the highlights of Burundi based on developments which have happened this week. We understand that the presidents of France and Zambia, that's President Francois Hollande and President Lungu, are advocating for inclusive dialogue in order to bring the crisis in Burundi to an end. We also understand that tax revenues have fallen by 17% due to the escalating crisis. The political crisis seems to have spurred economic contractions based on what's going on now. Now, we also understand that the East Africa Congress heads of state are urging or pushing for the violence to stop, also urging dialogue on the part of President Pierre Nkurunziza and the opposition. EAC is considering an independent investigation into the human rights violations, but for now, they're only in the process of considering and have not necessarily begun to carry out these investigations. The EALA has held that there are actually gross human rights violations, despite the fact that investigations have not been concluded just yet. Well, for more on an analysis on the situation going on in Burundi, we go live to Utah, where Professor John Mbaku, who is an economics professor at Weber University and non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, joins us. Professor, thank you very much for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Now, we're hearing and seeing a lot of criticism from even the likes of France and the United States, but there's very little action. In a realistic sense, what options are left for Burundi?
Well, obviously, the government of Burundi has either full of or unwilling to bring the violence to an end. I believe that it is now time for the African Union, working with regional partners in East Africa, such as the East African Community, to aggressively seek ways to bring the violence to an end. It's really important that Africans working with the African Union try to find a way to make sure that the killings stop, so that the people of Burundi can then engage in a national dialogue to find a more permanent solution to the...
But Professor, the thing that stands out in this case is the African Union is starting to come across as not necessarily being moved by this crisis anymore. We're seeing the new chairman pushing for his 5th term, which is more of a priority to him, as opposed to addressing the crisis in Burundi and also defending the fact that the option of troops was shelved. So it doesn't look as though it's a priority of the AU, which is why we're seeing a lot of potential action from EAC and the EALA.
Well, the thing is that if you remember what happened in Addis Ababa recently, when the chairmanship of the African Union was passed over from the president of Zimbabwe to the president of Chad. One of the things that the president of Chad said, which I find very interesting, is that he, in his acceptance speech, argued that Africans should be the main actors in the search for solutions to the continent's problems. He specifically mentioned Burundi and argued that Burundi is a continental problem and that Africans should be the ones to take care of that problem. And since the local authorities in Burundi have shown themselves either incapable of or unwilling to deal with the problem effectively, I believe that it is now time for the African Union to use its right to intervene, the right given to it by Article 4 of its charter, to do something about Burundi now before this problem turns into genocide. I think that the African Union should not continue to listen to the argument given by the government of Burundi, which argues that this is an internal affair and that for issues of sovereignty and independence, Burundi should be allowed to tackle the problem. The African Union needs to stop listening to those particular arguments. Yes.
Professor, that's the premise for my final question. In a case like this, where you have a president who has turned a deaf ear to the world and appears insensitive to the plight of his own people, what is the safest move to make, and also in a way that you do not necessarily violate the sovereignty of Burundi, but also address the crisis?
I think that what we see is a continuation of the violence. Even though the president of Burundi has given the African Union and the United Nations assurances that the government will be able to take care of the problem, that hasn't happened. And I think that Burundi, since Burundi is part of the African Union, is a member of the African Union, the African Union does have the right to intervene in cases where it has been determined that there are significant human rights violations, and especially given the history of Burundi with these kinds of problems. I think that it is now time for the African Union to act with some kind of force in order to make sure that the people of Burundi don't continue to get brutalized and killed and displaced. And I think that if we continue, if the African Union continues to remain cautious, we are going to end up with a situation such as that which occurred in Rwanda several years ago, and in Burundi many years ago, and that is genocide, and it's something that we don't want to see.
Indeed. Well, Professor John Mbaku, thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa. We appreciate your time. To come on Network Africa, the United Nations Security Council pushes for more unity and action to counter the expanding threat of the Islamic State.